So, Bob, what are some of the challenges that transitioning military personnel have with their resume? I mean, a lot of people talk about demilitarizing your resume, but is that really a good thing?
Well, it's yes and no. And I think that the first challenge that a lot of transitioning veterans get is they get so much advice. And there's lots of advice that just gets thrown out there. They say good advice is what's good for 80% of the people, 80% of the time. But a lot of folks coming out of the service, they don't fall into one of those 80%. So, the idea of demilitarizing your resume, and yes, it's good advice, but also it might not be. So the question really becomes, what are you trying to use this resume for? Who are you trying to get it out to? Because if you are in the government contracting spaces, for example, if you are a F-35 mechanic and you want to talk to somebody about the F-35, you certainly want to mention that you worked on the F-35, for example. So knowing who you're talking to, what company you're speaking with, and what kind of positions that you're talking about will let you know how much and how little to demilitarize your resume, or sometimes you might even want to highlight some of the things that you've done working with tools or working in locations or working with groups or something like that. Yes, it's good advice, but it's not always advice for everybody in every situation.
Can you give us some examples of what would be a very militarized term and how someone would demilitarize that?
Yeah, when it comes to terms, some of the things, when you start listing, just your specific, like I was a hospital corpsman. I mean, there's a lot of people who can't pronounce corpsman because it's got a P in the middle of it, let alone know what a hospital corpsman does. So if I were to just list myself as hospital corpsman, they wouldn't have known, and they certainly wouldn't have known that the last 3 years I was recruiting. So I would have listed myself as a healthcare recruiter, not as a hospital corpsman. Kind of the same thing goes when you look at job titles, as far as not just your rank as far as being a sergeant or a lieutenant colonel or whatever, but listing the billet. People like to list their billet as as operations maintenance chief. That doesn't really always translate. And then if you start, we'll get into a second about throwing too many big fluffy words in there, you actually only confuse people. So one of the first things to look at when you demilitarize is things like job titles.